You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Got the Dixie cam running here so you can see me today if you're watching this online. For those of you who are listening on the radio, welcome to the Dixie Heritage Hour. We're glad to have you with us. Our guest today is Carl Edwards, one of my favorite Dixie Heritage subscribers, probably one of our most intelligent Dixie Heritage subscribers. Excellent legal scholar, great mind. He's also the chairman for the state of Pennsylvania of the Constitution Party. That is a political party. And I called him on Skype, and we had a very interesting conversation talking about a number of things. And so for those of you who are listening on the radio and the audio cuts in and out, just realize that's because we're on Skype, and sometimes Skype does that. Of course, for those of you who are watching on the internet, it gives you a chance to see both Carl and I. So without any further ado, let's go into our interview with Carl Edwards. Carl, how are you doing today?
Hey, good.
Good.
Beautiful afternoon here in Penns Woods.
I'll say that's good. It's of course it's almost always sunny in Florida, but I was up in Maryland. Let's see, the last time I was up there was Lee Jackson weekend, and it was cold up there then. And I was up there for New Year's Eve, and it was like 4 degrees outside.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's been a very cold, especially the first part of the winter. Very cold. It has perked up a little in the last 2 weeks.
Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself? I know you had run for office in Pennsylvania.
Yes, I have. Not successfully, I might add. But I was born at a very early age in the foothills of the Pocono Mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania. Maybe not the heart of Yankee country, but the intestines at least. And so my early political bent, I think, was shaped somewhat by the fact that I always favored the underdog. And if you're a Philadelphia sports fan, other than just this weekend, that's a common commodity. And so from the beginning, when I first heard about the Confederacy, I became a follower of them, and then later, as I learned the principles for which they fought, I became a supporter of them through my as a oddball in all arguments and the relative merits of the Union versus the Confederacy, etc. In fact, when I was in college, one of the examination questions I had in biology class was Newton's law of gravity may be the underlying principle of some theorem that we were studying, and could you explain why? So since I had no clue what the answer was, I answered it this way. I said, Newton's law of gravity may be the underlying principle of this theorem, but not. They don't pay any attention to those federal laws. And so that's kind of my early perception of what should have happened in that war, and that the wrong side won. I became, at a very young age, we're in the frigid north, and only escaped it for a year at DJU in South Carolina, a supporter of the Southern cause. The way I got started in politics was answered an ad in the paper. They were looking for candidates for a particular office, a local Republican Party, and I had been a lifelong Republican, my dad before me and his dad before him. And so I answered this ad, and they sent out the organization director, and he talked to me, and while he didn't suggest I run for office, he recruited me as a committeeman. In fact, the organization was so thin and so sparse that they made me an area chairman right from the get-go. And so I became a quote-unquote loyal Republican. So loyal that I actually hung signs for Arlen Specter in the discredited belief that someday conservatives would have a voice in the Republican Party. And if we waited our turn and were faithful soldiers and did our duty and manned the polls and recruited Republicans and registered voters and did all those, went to street fairs and handed out literature, did all those necessary duties of the foot soldier, someday we would get our chance to express ourselves and have a voice in the governance of the party and therefore its policies. Well, unfortunately for conservatives, at least here in Pennsylvania, your time never comes. My wife was elected for one term to the Republican State Committee, and when we served there, we proposed a resolution that the state party not spend any money at all to oppose Republican candidates and candidates against Democrats, but and even endorsing, we didn't even try to limit endorsing. We said you can endorse candidates, but don't spend money against those that are unendorsed, and that failed. It failed big time. In fact, it was the conservatives in the party that initiated the vote that said we can't tie the hands of leadership, and that begged the question to me, well, if we can, who can? They are the dictators of the party. They run the show. They know better than us. They vet candidates. Yes, they vet them. They vet them for one thing only. How much money can you raise? That's the total, entire criteria by which they judge people. And so I toiled in the vineyards for quite some time there. Eventually became discouraged partially through that experience there on state committee. But I did run in 1989 for county council as a Republican, and in the year 2000 I ran for alternate delegate to the national convention and actually won, beating out the mayor of Allentown and a couple of other well-known people. And so I served, if you want to call it that capacity. It's nothing more than an infomercial. No decisions are made, at least not on the floor of the National Convention. Through all of that and my eventual resignation from the Republican Party, I began what I think may be unique north of the Mason-Dixon line, my annual, well, almost annual, I've missed 2 years, the Jefferson Davis Day Picnic to honor President Davis. I had spent so many years attending Lincoln Day breakfast, and now that I was out of the party, I don't know if I was spiteful, I hope not, but I wanted to do something that kind of stuck it in the craw of Lincoln Day, and so I named my affair Jefferson Davis Day.
Well, I remember, was it 2015 or 2016 that you invited me to give the keynote at the Jefferson Davis barbecue?
Yes, I did, and I appreciate that very much. And I appreciate your publication of the Dixie Weekly Review. That's a tremendous asset to those of us who follow the fortunes of the Southern movement. Unfortunately, most of it devoted nowadays to the defense of monuments and the defense of the flag, and that's just a shame that it has to be reduced to that, but that's where it is right now.
I know you were one of the first subscribers to Dixie Heritage because you had invited me, or you started talking to me about the Jefferson Davis barbecue not too long after we started putting the newsletter out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I might have been among the early ones, yes. I used to subscribe to a publication, internet publication newsletter called the Dixie Daily News back in the 70s and 80s. And so I thought, well, this is the natural the natural follow-up to that, and so I was attracted right off the bat.
So I never saw the Dixie Daily News, or were you correct in your assumption that we would be along the same line, or is it totally different? Or
no, it's very similar. He published stories on heritage and stories on current politics to the extent of the way they affected Southern heritage or the Southern movement. And he introduced me to the gentleman that you've had in your publication, the black gentleman that has marched all through the South carrying the battle flag. And his name,
Edgerton.
There you go. Yes. What a gentleman. What a testimony to the fact that it's not a racial issue, it's a freedom issue. And I think he exemplifies that in the best of lights.
One of the things that drew me to the Jefferson Davis barbecue was the website. And the Jefferson Davis barbecue website, it says, "We advocate limited government, decentralized authority, nullification of invalid federal laws, edicts and court opinions, godly statesmanship, and we even dare to breathe the word secession.
There you go. Yes, that's our guiding principles right there, kind of summed up. I think that nullification, interposition of the lesser magistrate, the idea of state calling federal laws that are unconstitutional, therefore, according to the words of the founders, invalid, calling them null and void within their borders and enforcing them with the powers that the state has, I think might be the single most effective means of resisting federal authority. Yes, we need to petition Congress. Yes, we need to march and demonstrate at times. Yes, we need to, take stands on individual legislation. But I think probably the single most effective tool is for states representing the sovereign people within their borders to stand up and just say no to the federal government and its usurped powers and overriding authority.
Right now I'm working on a book on secession.
Are you really? Excellent.
I am. Actually, I just submitted 3 articles today to the editor of the Barnes Review. I don't know if I've told you this or not, but at the first of the year I became a contributing editor at the Barnes Review.
Oh, no. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. And I just submitted 3 articles. I'm not exactly for sure when they'll appear, but they'll appear in 3 successive issues on the subject of secession.
Wonderful.
And then the book on secession will be released at some point after those 3 articles have run in the magazine. But one thing that I've noticed, and I've been invited over the years, I would say starting in about 2001 maybe, I started receiving invitations to speak to places, and in the year, was it 2003, 2004, in addition to pastoring that year, I spoke in 86 different places in Texas. The Sons of Confederate Veterans, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the League of the South, just different groups speaking Civil War reenactments and so forth. And even back then, speaking again to people who you would think would be in favor of secession, people who were supposed to be the advocates and the champions of Southern heritage.
Yes.
If I wanted to ruin the mood at a United Daughters of the Confederacy luncheon, all I had to do was say the word secession somewhere in my talk. As you probably have figured out, secession is a very it's a very taboo word, even in Southern heritage and Confederate circles.
Yes, it certainly is, and even more so, of course, in the mainstream and in the media and in our educational institutions. I think the thing that they forget, or maybe in a lot of cases choose to overlook, is in any government, someone has to be sovereign. If there's no sovereignty, there's no government. In a monarchy, of course, that's a king. In a dictatorship, that's one man. In oligarchy, that might be a committee. But in our established republic, our republic of distributed powers and separated powers with both a horizontal and a vertical limit on those powers, that sovereignty lies with the people of the several states. The states existed before the general government. They were the parties to the compact that established the general government, therefore are the reasonable limiters of that government's power. And if at a certain point in time that power becomes so unreasonable and so demanding and so egregious, then the withdrawal from that compact is just a natural rule of the law of contracts, as well as a natural right to withdraw from any association that we no longer feel comfortable with.
So what particularly happened, or maybe there was an evolution of things that happened, but how did you graduate, if you will, from being a Republican to being someone who would potentially advocate secession?
Well, it was a gradual process. Originally, I was quite gung-ho. As I said, my dad was a strong Republican, and I remember my first political hero, 1964, Barry Goldwater. And so I had a big Goldwater sign on my dad's paint truck. He was a painting contractor, and kind of got introduced to politics right there. And then, of course, Governor Scranton ran for governor in Pennsylvania, and I supported him, etc. And so I was indoctrinated with the theory, and it is just, well, it's worse than a theory. It's a deceit that the Republican Party is conservative, quote unquote. The Republican Party is pro-life, quote unquote. Republican Party is for limited government, quote unquote. Well, as I had experiences in that party and understood the leadership of that party, I began to become disillusioned with that theory altogether, to the point where in 2005, shortly after Florida Governor Jeb Bush and his brother President George W. Bush refused to do anything on behalf of Terry Schiavo, and the judicial murder is really what it was, a judicial murder of an innocent young woman. That was kind of the last straw. And June 30th, 2005, I resigned from the Republican committee. So that's kind of brought the evolution to a close.
I know when you left the Republican Party, I don't know if you went straight to the Constitution Party or if there was even a process in getting to the Constitution Party. How did that work?
No, I went pretty quickly there, too, because in the year before that, in 2004, I had attended a convention that they put on. Well, actually, two affairs. One was their national convention, at which I heard the delegate from Mississippi get up and announce his votes, and he said, quote, "The great state of Mississippi proudly casts its electoral votes for a candidate, Michael Perutka, and we represent the last constitutionally elected president, Jefferson Davis." So as soon as he said that, he had me right there. I was won over. But the year before that, I had attended a convention that they put on here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and they had Roy Moore of Alabama, Justice Roy Moore at that time, and they had Alan Keyes, who later ran for president. And so we got to talk with individually those two men and question them. And at that point, I thought, if they can produce these kind of genuine conservative, genuine limited government individuals, genuine federalists, then that's probably the party for me. And so I changed my registration late in the year 2005.
And I know you ran for office again under the Constitution Party ticket. I know was it 2006 you ran for the state legislature?
No, 2006 I ran for the U.S. Senate, believe it or not.
Okay.
Against Rick Santorum. But needless to say, I wasn't the eventual winner in that race. But it was a fun experience, and I got to address the small gathered crowd from the steps in the rotunda of the state capitol. That was kind of a thrill. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I kept a copy of that speech. Someone filmed it, and so I guess that was the highlight of my political career, the high water mark.
So explain to me, I believe it was 2008. Maybe it was 2012, but I'm pretty sure it was 2008. I remember in the early part of the Republican primaries, Rick Santorum was my favorite. He was my favorite horse, even though I knew he wasn't going to win.
That might have been. Well, he was elected in '98 initially, and then 2004, and then 2010 he was defeated by Bob Casey.
Okay, but this was when Rick Santorum was running for president.
Oh, for president.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
I want to say it was 2008, and I, like I said, he was my favorite horse in the Republican Party. I knew he wasn't going to win the primary, but he impressed me. So was he as impressive as I thought he was, or not really so?
Well, while he was in office, I made the flat statement that he's the best U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania in my lifetime, and I'll still stand by that statement today. I think he's a good man. I think he's an honest man. I think he's a family man. Mm-hmm. I think he has strong values. I'm not sure that he understands fully limited government, decentralized government. Not sure that he understands vertical separation of powers, dual sovereignty, if you will, and those principles. But I think his core beliefs are on the right side of the ledger.
Go ahead and explain dual sovereignty for our listeners. That's probably a new term to some of them.
Yeah, it is a concept that, of course, has been lost totally in our history and civics classes, both at secondary school and in college. Everyone learns about separation of powers. The basic civics class, 6th grade, they teach you that the founders set up the government in order to separate powers, realizing through the strong Calvinism and understanding of the depravity of man that power corrupts and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so they set up a general government, or we call it nowadays the federal government, with a legislative, a judicial, and an executive branch in order to separate those powers and keep them from being congealed under one centralized authority of even one man or even of a few men. And so they understood that principle, and although they, in the doctrine of separation of powers, they also left some cross currents and open doors where each one can invade somewhat the other one's area in order, again, to provide a check and a balance. And so most Americans, well, in this day and age, maybe not, but most students of history understand that concept. But dual sovereignty is the vertical relationship between the states and the general government, federal government, that mostly is left totally ignored in the day and age in which we live. And what it says is that the states, being the parties to the compact called the United States Constitution, the creators of the United States, therefore the sovereignty that is given to them, or I should say loaned to them, people, we are the absolute sovereigns. We never relinquish our rights, but we do delegate powers to governments to protect our rights. And so we temporarily lend them powers in order to protect our rights. The primary recipient of that is the state governments. They were in place before the Constitution was ever proposed, let alone ratified and adopted. And so there's the repository of the majority of the powers that we relinquish to or delegate to government. And so then those states came together in the Constitutional Convention of 1887. They, again, formed a compact to specifically designate certain enumerated powers to a general government, and as the 10th Amendment says, that all powers not given to the United States by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively and to the people. And so dual sovereignty says the majority of the powers that we've delegated to government lie with our local and state governments, and only a very limited amount, only those specifically enumerated in the Constitution, are powers that we delegate through the states, through the state ratifying convention. It was not a general referendum that ratified the Constitution. It was state ratifying conventions, many of which are very interesting, especially the Virginia State Ratifying Convention, where a motion was made to specifically say that if the promises and the guarantees given of us of retaining our rights is not carried out in the national government, we reserve the right to withdraw from the compact. And so it was understood right from the very beginning that the national government is not supreme. It has no sovereignty. The powers that they have are strictly limited by the text and the understanding of the Constitution, and are delegated from the people of the sovereign states. And so dual sovereignty says, yes, we owe some allegiance, we owe some responsibility to the general government, but the primary source of our responsibility and allegiance is to our state governments.
You know, that was the thought that was prevalent in the day, because, you know, when Robert E. Lee basically rejected the command of the Union Army, President Lincoln had offered it to him, had offered to promote him ahead of several senior officers to give him command of the Federal Army. He essentially resigned his commission at that point, and basically he said, I will never again raise my sword save in the defense of Virginia.
And I'm sure you're familiar with Gods and Generals, and that scene where he's in the office with the Federal Secretary of State, I believe that was Stanton at the time, told him that exactly that was his position. I think one of the most moving scenes that I've ever seen concerning that particular principle. General Lee is being His statues are being defaced, moved, torn down, litigated against. I'll tell you, if these people who want to remove his statues had a thimbleful of his character, there's no way it would be happening.
That's true. And, there was another scene in that movie as well, when Stonewall Jackson was talking to the father of one of his cadets. And he tells him, he says, "I'm a Union man." He says, "But as we both know, the state of Virginia is meeting in legislative session right now, and more than likely they will vote for secession. And when they do," he said, "the sentiments of Virginia will command my own." He said, so even though he was in favor of staying in the Union, if Virginia seceded, he would be a secessionist.
Yes, and President Davis the same. His farewell speech to the Senate, and through his senatorial career, he expressed over and over again his loyalties to the Union. And these men, I think, were forced by conscience to make the decision they did, and I believe they made the right one. I think history has proved that correct. We would have nowhere near the overwhelming, overweening, overriding, browbeating federal government that we have today into every area of our life, including how much water is in our toilet bowls. That wouldn't exist today if those men had prevailed in that conflict.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. Well, I know that there were several legal theories, if you will, that were put in place by the founders that were intended to make secession unnecessary, that essentially had to be bypassed. Things like nullification, that had they been successfully practiced, secession would not have been necessary. Explain how nullification would work.
Okay, well, nullification is the step, if you would, just below secession, I believe. The next step, what Thomas Jefferson called the rightful remedy. I know reading in an interview is frowned upon, but I'd like to read just a little bit here of a quote from James Madison, also known as the father of the Constitution. And he said this: "The states then, being the parties to the Constitutional Compact, and in their sovereign capacity, it follows of necessity that there can be no tribunal above their authority to decide in the last resort whether the compact made by them be violated, and consequently that as the parties to it, they must themselves decide in the last resort such questions as may be of sufficient magnitude to require their interposition." He also said, "In the case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, the states who are parties thereto have the right and are duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them." Mr. Jefferson, in the Kentucky resolutions, also adopted in 1798 at the same time as the Virginia resolutions, they were written by Mr. Madison, the Kentucky resolutions by Mr. Jefferson, called nullification the rightful remedy, the conservative way for the citizens, the sovereign citizen, to regain their powers that have been usurped by a government gone awry. And so it's not some new right-wing idea that came out of some zealot some racist, they would say nowadays, zealot from Georgia or somewhere. It was proposed by Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Madison, both of whom had considerable knowledge of the Constitution.
Well, nullification, not only could it be used at the federal level, well, before we get into that discussion, why don't you give us an example of specifically how a state either has or could nullify federal law?
Yes, well, I tell you, the best place to get examples, and it's just replete with them, is the 10th Amendment Center. I don't know if you've heard of that organization. Michael Bolden, they have a website, and they are constantly lobbying throughout the United States for nullifying invalid, unconstitutional federal laws. And they've had many, many victories. Many of them small, true, but many of them fairly large, concerning the right to keep and bear arms, concerning privacy and the Fourth Amendment. And kind of a unique one happened in Utah, where I guess the Federal Emergency Management Authority has a huge supercomputer complex. And so the state of Utah passed a resolution saying that they will not be duty bound to sell water. And if you know anything about large computers, they need water to cool them. And so they passed a resolution that if acts and invasions of privacy and violations of the Fourth Amendment occur in that facility, that they are not duty bound to sell them water, nor the communities around them. So they're going to choke the horse right where it lives, denying them water for their supercomputers. But that's just kind of a amusing and small example. But there are so many across the length and breadth of the country. In fact, they publish monthly a list of various laws, resolutions that have passed in various states, liberal states, conservative states, all over the country. People are wanting to limit the overwhelming power of the feds. And so it's a movement who's probably the strongest that it's ever been since the days before the Great War. If your viewers, listeners are interested in learning more about it, I'd recommend the 10th Amendment Center. And of course, you probably have read the book on nullification by Tom Woods, the libertarian scholar. He wrote a book on nullification in 2012 maybe, and it's excellent. Goes into the entire history of it, shows that it was not initially, in fact, it never was used in defense of slavery, not in its whole history. John C. Calhoun proposed its use in 1828 against the Tariff of Abominations passed by Congress, and so it became associated with Calhoun, but it never was used in defense of slavery. In fact, northern states nullified, in effect, the Fugitive Slave Act through passing freedom laws, they call them, within their borders. So it doesn't have a racist history. It doesn't even particularly have necessarily a Southern history. It's a constitutional concept that should be that all states should be aware of, and the governors and the legislators of the several states should use that tool in the most important work they have to do, I think, which is not fixing roads and bridges or even passing budgets, or in our state here, pension has gone awry and it's just eating the very heart out of the economy. Even though as important as those things are, I think resistance to federal authority is maybe the single most important thing they can do right now.
Well, do you think that the left, especially in the federal government, is using nullification against President Trump right now?
Of course, there's the famous and publicized area of sanctuary cities right now, and of course there are some in California who have used that very word that we said earlier is unthinkable and not even to be contemplated, that idea of secession. And so, yeah, the left is using it also, and in areas where the Constitution protects that, I have no problem with that. In fact, I kind of like to see California go.
Well, I would say good riddance as well. But as far as the left being able to use the principle of nullification against the president, why is it that the left doesn't seem to have a problem using nullification when it suits their agenda, but yet those on the right refuse to do it when it would advance theirs.
Well, I think the left is more dedicated, more sold out to their cause. They have a long-term vision, and they'll use whatever tool is handy at any point in time to further their agenda. They never lose sight of the bottom line. We want socialism. That's really what it is. We want state control of everything. And so incrementally, we'll take a little here, a little there. If nullification helps us on this point, we'll take it. If federal authority, if the supremacy clause helps us on this point, we'll take it. They'll use whatever tool is at their disposal because I think they totally lack principle. They're amoral, and so they'll use any tool that's available to further their agenda, and they never lose sight of the goal, that is socialized government control of every facet of our life.
Well, when the left uses things like nullification, the right never comes over and says you can't do that, because I believe that most politicians on the right realize that nullification is a valid legal doctrine. But yet they refuse to use it themselves. And yet whenever anyone on the right does talk about nullification, of course those on the left are, you can't do that, you can't do that. In other words, they're opposed to it when they're not the ones doing it.
Yes, well, that's hypocritical, I suppose, on their part, and maybe we can commend ourselves and say the right has some principle, but they certainly don't have the understanding of nullification and its rightful use, or they would be raising it constantly, because there is so much of federal regulation. Somebody estimated that 90% of federal laws and an even higher percentage of federal regulations violate the Constitution. And so it's a tool that the right should use, that genuine conservatives should use, that limited government advocates should use constantly. It should be in the news all the time. Some legislature, some governor. I'd like to see the governor of South Dakota some years back, Governor Hoeven, he's a United States Senator now. His legislature, God bless them, passed a strong pro-life law, completely banning abortion except in the cases of rape, incest, and life of the mother. And I don't agree with exceptions, but that's another issue. Strong pro-life legislation. Then Governor Hoeven held a press conference and said, now we must fight it through the courts. I wrote him a letter and said, no, don't fight it through the courts. It's the courts that usurp the power that caused abortion to be so prolific and so widespread as it is now. Your legislature has duly constituted legislature, has passed the law. You're the executive power of that state. Take the state police if you must and surround those abortuaries, and do not allow any federal authority to come in and open them up. And Barack Obama was president at that time. I don't think he would have risked the political capital to send federal troops to open abortion clinics. I just don't think he would have done that. It would have been a tremendous victory for life, and unfortunately, he said we're going to fight it through the courts. Well, the federal courts are exactly that, federal courts. And so when they determine the limits of the power of the federal government, they are in effect the very definition of tyranny. Tyranny says, I will determine my own limits. That's exactly what the federal courts do on behalf of the whole federal government.
Well, now that we've kind of gone into the subject of courts, that's another subject of nullification, jury nullification.
Yes. That concept is probably even lesser known. Again, the name is going to escape me. Independent Jury Association, is that? I'm not sure, but they have excellent pamphlets that are short, not difficult reading, can be read in 10 minutes or less, and I have a whole bunch of them. When anyone gets called for jury duty, I immediately try to hand them one of those pamphlets, educate them on jury nullification, which simply says that juries can not only judge the law of the matter. The judge in his charge to the jury will say, now you determine the facts, we'll determine the law. No. Juries have the right to determine the justice in a matter. And if a law is unjust, if a law is unconstitutional, if a law is overbearing and onerous, a jury has a right to declare that person not guilty. And so they need educated to that right and understanding the power they have as a juror. It's tremendously underplayed by the judicial system and by judges themselves that want you to think they're the final arbiter, just as the Supreme Court thinks it's the final arbiter of the Constitution. The Constitution is not what the Supreme Court says it is. It's what the founders and ratifiers understood it to be. And it's the same way with local common pleas and criminal courts.
So let's put this in very plain terminology so that all of our listeners can't possibly miss the point.
Okay.
If you're serving on a jury and you believe that the law in question is unjust, it would be acceptable to find the defendant not guilty to nullify the unjust law.
That is exactly right. Now, of course, that doesn't repeal the law nor have any effect beyond that individual case, but it's a blow for liberty in that individual case, and it's descended from English common law, common American practice through the first century and a half or so, and needs to be revived today, and jurors need to be educated to understand they have that power. As citizens, they have that power, and not to relinquish it to some black-robed gentleman who tries to intimidate them.
Well, I think one thing that prosecutors do is they will pile on charges. And I think the thinking behind that is that the jury will be overwhelmed. Well, if this person's been accused of 103 different crimes, obviously he must be guilty of something.
Yes. And unfortunately, they're probably correct in some of those assumptions. All of us, we're probably violating laws as we sit here, Ed. The laws are so onerous and so far-reaching and so pervasive that it's almost impossible not to break some kind of a law every day you live.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today. Continuing our discussion on nullification, we've talked about nullification of federal law by the states, agencies within the federal government nullifying the edicts of other federal agencies during nullification. Nullification is even something that can be used at a much smaller level. In other words, a county or a city could nullify either federal or state law.
Well, it depends, of course, on the constitution of the individual state. In our state, it's written clearly that the state power overrides any of the municipalities. That municipalities are merely zones, administrative agencies of the state. So here in Pennsylvania, unfortunately, and we ought to amend that, our Constitution, the new one created in 1968, makes the state law supreme against any municipality or school district or any of the lesser authorities. So unfortunately in Pennsylvania, we can't constitutionally do that. We can still, of course, point out the injustices and exercise another right that Americans have, and that's civil disobedience. I'm going to disobey this law because it's unjust, it's applied onerously, it's overwhelming, it's egregious, and so I'm going to deliberately disobey that law. Now, I think with civil disobedience, unlike nullification, you're standing with the law because the Constitution is the supreme law, but in civil disobedience, you are deliberately disobeying the law, and so you have to be willing to take the consequences. But you could write a letter from Birmingham jail or Philadelphia County Jail in our case and make a point that might resonate across the country and end up seeing some injustice overturned. So even in Pennsylvania, we can do that. But a lot of states, you're absolutely right. The local municipalities have every right to overthrow any unconstitutional edict of the state government. And of course, we ought to resist them wherever we live and under whatever authority we have committed ourselves. We need to resist tyranny wherever it raises its ugly head.
Well, I know that we've had some discussions. It's been probably a year since you and I have had these discussions. But I remember back in 2016, and it must have been 2016 when I spoke at the Jefferson Davis barbecue.
Yes, it was.
Because I remember now that Donald Trump was running for president.
Yes.
And had just got the Republican nomination. So I remember you were not a fan of Donald Trump.
No.
And
No.
I'm asking a question not knowing the answer, which is a dangerous thing to do in an interview.
They say an interviewer should never do that. Never hold an election unless you know the outcome.
Well, that's definitely what they did in the late 1860s and 1870s when the Republicans would station the army at the ballot boxes to make sure that certain people didn't vote.
That's it. Well, Donald Trump, I have to admit, I've softened my position on him quite a bit. I don't think he's a man of character, unfortunately, but I think he is a populist, and some of the populist ideas that he's adopted are principles that we as conservatives can embrace and support him in those things that he's done on that score. I don't think that he's a principled conservative. I don't think he's a moral man. I, of course, have no evidence one way or the other. That's merely an assumption from reputation, which is a dangerous thing to do. But I believe he has, maybe inadvertently, fallen onto some, through his innate populism and appeal to the people, some good things, and he's certainly done some good things. I'll tell you, this tax bill that reduced the corporate income tax has just been a terrific measure and is already, just a month later, stimulating the economy and raises coming down and bonuses coming down. I myself, in my little paycheck, experienced $155.15 more than I did in December. So he's done some good things, no question.
Well, that's definitely a good thing to hear. I know everybody likes to have a little bit more money in their paycheck.
Yes.
You know, Nancy Pelosi the other day said your $155 check was crumbs.
Yeah.
Did you hear that?
that. I heard that. Well, I'll tell you, her husband, from what I understand, is a multi-millionaire, maybe a multi-billionaire, and so I don't think she has any platform or any moral authority to preach to entrepreneurs that they are being selfish or whatever terminology she wants to use. Nazis, they throw that a lot, to want to retain some of the profits that they've earned by the sweat of their brow and by the wisdom of their investments and by their hard work of themselves and their employees. They certainly have every right to enjoy those benefits and not have them confiscated at the point of a gun, which is what happens, even though tax law is supposedly quote-unquote voluntary. Ask Mr. Schiff and others what happens if you violate it. So at the point of a gun, they confiscate the living. What was it in the Declaration? It said they eat out our sustenance, and they certainly do.
Burger one might be crazy, but I ain't dumb. Crazy cooter coming at you. Hey, y'all, got your ears on? Well, I got some news for you. We're here at our brand new Cooters in the Country store in Sperryville, Virginia. Good old Sperryville, where Cooters started many years ago. Folks are coming from all over Hazard County, and we're going to have a grand old time with good music, good food, and best of all, good friends. Hope y'all can be there. Whoop, whoop, here come Enos. Huck got Cletus with her. I'm down and I'm gone.
This interview is not going to air until after the Super Bowl.
Oh, okay, good.
And so I'm going to ask you a question, and now our listeners 2 or 3 weeks from now are going to hear your prediction and can determine whether or not you are a prophet or a false prophet. Being the Philadelphia Eagles fan that you are, what is going to happen in the Super Bowl?
Well, truthfully, I'm not much of a Philadelphia Eagles fan. I used to follow football years ago, and my team was the 1960 Eagles that won the NFL championship against the vaunted Green Bay Packers. Most of your listeners think that's ancient history, probably not even sure that occurred, but we had a local hero here, Chuck Bednarik from Bethlehem Catholic, who played for the Eagles. They called him Concrete Charlie. That team was very, very popular in this area. But now again, there's Eagles fervor here. I'm afraid, though, Mr. Brady and his experience will prevail and that the Eagles will lose.
Well, I know I was rooting for the Jaguars here a couple of weeks ago. Again, not that I expected them to win. Of course, being from Florida, or I said I'm not from Florida, but I'm living in Florida now, and I have for several years. You know, you want to wish the best for the local team. But for the most part, I'm just a fan of whoever's playing the Patriots.
Yeah. Yes, I like to see a good football game, and as I said, I haven't followed it for years, simply, to tell you the truth, because they play on the Lord's Day, and I observe the Lord's Day, and so I don't really see much football. Maybe once in a while on YouTube is the principal way. I see them after they're over. That's the main way that I see football nowadays.
So
I'm actually a baseball guy. Phillies are my team, I guess you would call it, since the mid-'50s, but they've also fallen on hard times lately.
Well, yesterday we saw the announcement that the Cleveland Indians are getting rid of Chief Wahoo.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you, this political correctness, or what would you call it, scrubbing of the culture by those in the know, quote unquote, pretty soon you won't be able to reference anything by its proper name. You'll have to get an American dictionary of sanitized language and look up what you can call anything. It's disgusting is what it is, and certainly I try to break those rules whenever I can, whenever appropriate, and at least let folks know there's one voice who still believes that you call a whatever it is by its name. And so the Washington Redskins have been a Redskin since they were in Boston, and Yahoo has been there many, many years in Cleveland, and also Chief Nakahoma, I don't know if you remember him, down in Atlanta. And so I have no trouble with those symbolism. I don't think Americans of that descent have any problem with those symbolism for the most part. It's just those political terrorists who want to cow us into doing things their way.
Well, I don't have the exact numbers, in front of me. They'll appear in what will be, for the time of this recording, next Friday's Dixie Heritage. The Washington Redskins in the NFL took a poll to determine if their name Redskins was offensive. And they had the Washington Post conduct a poll, and they conducted, I want to say it was 500 and some just randomly selected Native Americans across the country. And I want to say, if my memory serves, it was 74% of them said they were not offended.
Well, good. I hope that's a good slap in the teeth to those who are calling for the name change.
And of the 26% who would not say they were not offended, that did not mean that they were violently offended. That just meant that, they had some varying degree of support for a name change. That didn't necessarily mean that they found the name offensive.
Right. I think it's proper and good to be proud of your heritage. I think that the individual cultures around the country, Southern culture that you're working so hard to defend, the Northern Midwest, the Scandinavian culture, the Southeast, all various areas of the country have cultures that have descended from forebears and have followed for generations. And I think Americans have every right to enjoy them, to propagate them, to teach them to your children. That doesn't make you disloyal to the United States, or it doesn't make you a racist or a nativist or any of those terms that they throw around. I think it makes you cognizant of your forebears, proud of that fact, but also that you're an American and you're part of the land of the free and the home of the brave. Or as they say in Atlanta, the home of the Braves.
Well, Baptists did not name themselves. That was a name that they received from their enemies.
Yes.
And rebels, Southerners, I do not believe would have chosen the name rebels.
No.
But that's the name that they were given by their critics, by their enemies. And now we're proud of it.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I wonder how many Native Americans, how many Indians, if you will, they might not have chosen the names Redskins or Indians for themselves, but I wonder how many of them now would wear it as a badge of honor.
Absolutely. And they should. Absolutely they should. Ole Miss, they call themselves the Rebels for many years. I don't know if they've changed that. I know they've banned the flag, I guess, you have to, I don't know, if you bring your own, they may let you wave it or something. But I always used to enjoy watching University of Mississippi football game, because you would see just a sea of display of the battle flag, and they were proud. And of course, Colonel Reb rode the horse when they scored a touchdown, and that was just part of the culture, and should be preserved, not done away with to some sanitized, pristine idea that some multiculturalist has in mind for all of us.
Well, was there anything that you were wanting to say or talk about that we didn't get to?
I think there is one thing that I would like to add. You mentioned my picnic, and as I said, I think maybe it might be unique north of the Mason-Dixon line. I'm not sure. But every year when I open it, I tell the folks that because here in Northampton, Pennsylvania, we're probably 100 miles or so north of the angle in the stone wall at Gettysburg, which was the high water mark of the Confederacy. We now consider ourselves the high water mark of the Confederacy, not in battle or in war, but in the principles, the ideals, limited government, godly statesmanship, as we say on our banner, the right of the people to defend their sovereignty against tyranny, wherever it may rear its ugly head. I'd like to think we're the high water mark right here in Pennsylvania.
You definitely did a great job with that barbecue the time I was there. And I was amazed at the crowd that you drew and the support that it garnered. Again, for you to bring that many people out with that many Confederate flags in support of Southern heritage that far north, you deserve the title high water mark of the Confederacy.
Well, thank you, Ed. I appreciate that a whole lot.
And
I've enjoyed as time goes on.
I've enjoyed chatting with you again, and we'll have to do it. We'll have to find a time here in a couple months, maybe do it again.
All right, that would be great. And it's a pleasure talking to you again, and I'm hoping to have a picnic in 2018, Lord willing, and love to have you there again.
Okay, we'll try to make that happen.
Thank you, sir.
All right. God bless, Carl.
God bless.
By
Bye-bye now.
conversation, Carl and I were talking about Chief Wahoo and the Cleveland Indians. So I put on my Chief Wahoo hat. Hope you enjoyed our interview today. Go to Carl's website. It's www.jeffersondavisdaypicnic.org. And then go to my website, dixieheritage.net. Find out all about Carl's Barbecue. If you can attend, great food, great fellowship. I'll look forward to seeing you there. And while you're at my website, sign up for our free newsletter, get a free copy of my book, shoot me an email, let me know who you are, and that you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour.